Welcome to the Golden Gems podcast. Today, we're taking a deep dive into LSD, a microscopic synthetic molecule that dissolved the boundaries of human consciousness, engineered the personal computer revolution, and went from being the most suppressed cognitive tool in American history to the center of a 2026 medical revolution.
And the timing for this specific deep dive really couldn't be more precise. We have a massive stack of sources for you today, ranging from, declassified government docs to the latest patent filings.
Right, because today is April 19th, 2026.
Exactly.
Which, if you follow the cultural calendar, is Bicycle Day. It marks exactly 83 years since the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann deliberately ingested 250 micrograms of lysergic acid diethylamide and just, rode his bike home through Basel.
Which was the first intentional acid trip in human history.
Yeah. And that anniversary coincides with a massive structural shift that literally just happened. Looking at the documents on yesterday's policy changes, on April 18th, 2026, President Donald J. Trump signed an executive order titled Accelerating Medical Treatments for Serious Mental Illness.
Right, which completely dismantles the bureaucratic blockades that have stifled research for well over 50 years.
It's a total reversal. Just looking at the sheer volume in your notes, the DEA set the 2026 production quota for LSD at 1,200 grams. Now, because doses are measured in micrograms, 1,200 grams is enough for 12 million therapeutic doses.
It's staggering.
Yeah.
That quota represents a complete repudiation of the prohibition era. But to really understand how a single synthetic compound could bridge a Swiss laboratory in Silicon Valley, we have to look at the mechanical reality of what this molecule actually does to the human brain.
Because the history actually begins with a failure, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
In 1938, at Sandow's laboratories, Albert Hofmann was trying to isolate a respiratory and circulatory stimulant from ergot.
Right, and ergot is that parasitic fungus that infects rye. Historically, it caused St. Anthony's fire,
Yes.
which is this medieval nightmare of mass outbreaks of gangrene and terrifying hallucinations for anyone who ate the infected bread. So Hofmann is working with something inherently volatile, trying to find a medical application.
Exactly. So he synthesizes the 25th derivative, right?
Mm-hmm.
LSD-25. He tests it on animals, and it does absolutely nothing for the respiratory system.
Literally nothing.
Nothing. I mean, the only observable anomaly during those initial tests was that the animals became remarkably restless. In a results-driven pharmaceutical environment, that was deemed a complete dead end, so the compound was just shelved for 5 years.
Until 1943.
Right. Hoffman harbored what he later called a peculiar presentiment, just this inexplicable intuition that this specific molecular structure had undiscovered properties. So on April 16, 1943, he synthesized a fresh batch, and a microscopic trace amount accidentally absorbed through his skin.
Which perfectly illustrates the extraordinarily steep dose-response curve you highlighted in the research. I mean, the threshold dose for LSD, the point where human perception just begins to shift, is a mere 20 micrograms.
It's almost imperceptible by weight.
Yeah, and a standard therapeutic dose is between 100 and 200 micrograms. So the difference between feeling a slight perceptual shift and experiencing complete ego dissolution is a factor of barely 5 to 10. When you compare that to alcohol, where the margin between a mild buzz and dangerous toxicity is vastly wider, the necessity for absolute dosing precision becomes so obvious.
And that precision is dictated by the physical mechanics at the receptor level. When you examine the crystallography of the brain on LSD, you see exactly why a dose measured in millionths of a gram lasts for 8 to 12 hours.
Because it targets the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor.
Exactly. Most standard drugs bind to a receptor briefly, trigger a biological response, and then release. But LSD employs this completely unique mechanism. When the molecule enters the receptor's binding pocket, an extracellular loop of the receptor protein actually folds over it like a lid.
Wow.
Yeah, it creates a physical mechanical lock. The molecule is literally trapped. It cannot be metabolized or displaced by your brain's natural serotonin until that protein slowly changes shape over the course of the day.
Okay, let me make sure I'm processing this right, because this mechanism is critical. It's not that the drug is constantly flooding the system over those 12 hours.
No, not at all.
It's literally bolted to the receptor. And the result of that lock isn't the brain creating delusions out of thin air.
Yeah.
From what I'm reading in your notes, it's more like, well, you know when you turn off the spam filter on your email and suddenly you see the thousands of junk messages your computer was hiding from you?
Yes.
Is the brain basically just experiencing its own raw sensory data all at once?
That spam filter analogy is the exact biological reality. Aldous Huxley famously described the brain as a reducing valve. Our sensory apparatus receives millions of photons and complex sound waves every single second.
Which would be overwhelming.
Completely. If all that information reached conscious awareness simultaneously, you would be paralyzed by the sheer volume of data. Evolution solved this by building a hierarchical filter system which modern neuroscience identifies primarily as the default mode network, or the DMN. The DMN filters out 99.9% of sensory input, leaving only a narrow, highly curated stream selected purely for evolutionary survival.
So the molecule doesn't add hallucinations at all, it just removes the filter.
Exactly.
The default mode network is essentially the seat of your ego. It maintains your autobiographical memory, your future anxieties, your entire concept of I. So when LSD mechanically locks into those receptors and disrupts the DMN, that self-model dissolves.
Yes, and that's why the visual breathing, the geometric patterns, the synesthesia, where users describe seeing sound or tasting color, these are actually the mathematical representations of your own neural architecture.
Yeah.
They're finally made visible because the evolutionary filter has been suspended.
That is fascinating. But because the DMN is essentially the operating system of human consciousness, breaking it down has profound implications. And if you look at your historical sources, you see two completely opposite simultaneous reactions to that power.
Oh, absolutely.
You had government institutions trying to harness it for psychological control and individuals trying to harness it for cognitive liberation.
Right, which brings us to the CIA. As you know from the InCulture files and the research stack, the CIA spent the 1950s trying to weaponize this. Under Sidney Gottlieb, they established a program that dosed prisoners, mental patients, and even their own personnel without consent.
But what's fascinating is why they thought it was a weapon. They believed LSD could be the ultimate truth serum, which shows they fundamentally misunderstood the pharmacology.
Yeah, you really did.
They assumed that if you dissolve the ego, you strip away a person's ability to lie. Instead, they just fragmented the subject's realities, leading to tragedies like the death of Frank Olson, the bioweapons scientist who was covertly dosed and fell from a 10th floor window days later.
The irony of InCulture is staggering. The government recognized the molecule's efficacy enough to run clandestine operations for 20 years, ultimately destroying their own records in 1973 to cover their tracks. Meanwhile, academics like Timothy Leary at Harvard recognized the exact same ego-dissolving properties but advocated for widespread public consciousness expansion.
Which did not go over well with the establishment.
No. Leary's dismissal from Harvard in 1963 was the catalyst that pushed the molecule out of the clinical setting and directly into the counterculture, leading to the mass distribution of highly pure LSD by underground chemists.
And the ultimate expression of that underground chemistry brings us back to that staggering forensic reality we started with, the missile silo industrial complex of the 1990s.
Yes, William Leonard Pickard.
Right. He set up a pharmaceutical-scale manufacturing facility inside a decommissioned Atlasy nuclear bunker in Wamego, Kansas. We are talking about independent power grids, climate control, and total isolation. It was the perfect conditions for sterile, massive-scale synthesis.
The logistics of Pickard's operation were unprecedented in the history of clandestine chemistry. The DEA estimated that this single facility produced 90% of the global LSD supply during its peak years.
90%, that's unbelievable.
And he utilized a highly sophisticated decentralized distribution network, ensuring he had zero direct contact with the end users. It was a masterpiece of logistics, until Pickard was finally betrayed by his informant landlord, Gordon Todd Skinner, and arrested in November 2000.
Which caused global acid availability to plummet by roughly 95% practically overnight. The planetary access to consciousness expansion was secretly dependent on a single chemist's network.
Exactly.
Which raises a massive analytical question about the architecture of prohibition. If an entire planet supply was flowing from one rogue missile silo, does that prove the drug war was a success when they finally caught him? Or does it just highlight the absolute absurdity that a single underground chemist essentially outmaneuvered the global enforcement apparatus for a decade?
Well, it certainly highlights the systemic fragility of prohibition. But more importantly, Pickard's decentralized distribution network wasn't just a clandestine operation. It was a conceptual blueprint. While he was industrializing the supply in a concrete bunker, the minds consuming the molecule were actively engineering the modern world.
They were translating the radical cognitive flexibility of a trip into the technology you use every single day.
Which brings us directly to the tech pioneers in your notes, the Silicon Valley paradigm shift. We have Steve Jobs stating publicly that taking LSD was one of the most important things he had ever done, heavily influencing Apple's design philosophy.
Right, and Douglas Engelbart, who participated in early LSD research and then delivered his 1968 mother of all demos, where he essentially invented the computer mouse, hypertext, and the graphical user interface.
And you have Stuart Brand's Whole Earth Catalog, which merged psychedelic exploration with early hacker culture. What is essential to understand here is the mechanism of that inspiration. LSD did not merely give these pioneers good ideas. It actively dissolved the conceptual boundaries that prevented those ideas from forming.
Going back to the synesthesia we discussed, the cross-wiring of the brain.
Exactly. That allowed a programmer like Engelbart to visualize abstract code as a physical, navigable space. It allowed tech pioneers to envision decentralized, interconnected digital networks long before the physical internet existed, because they had just experienced the decentralized restructuring of their own minds.
It acted as a catalyst for paradigm shifts rather than incremental improvements. Here's where it gets really interesting to me. We typically view the rigid, mathematical world of computing as the exact opposite of the 1960s hippie counterculture.
Oh, for sure.
But the evidence shows the molecule was the bridge. It acted like open-source software for the human brain, allowing developers to imagine the graphical user interface because they had literally just experienced the visual restructuring of their own minds.
And that exact same restructuring catalyzed a creative explosion across all mediums. The Beatles' creation of Steep Peppers, utilizing tape loops and backward recording, wasn't just experimental music. It was a direct mechanical translation of how altered sensory processing perceives time and sound.
Yeah, and Pink Floyd designing the dark side of the moon to explore infinite layers of auditory input.
Or the Grateful Dead translating acid consciousness into live, decentralized sonic architecture. You see it in the visual mappings of neural networks by artist Alex Gray, and the literary deconstructions of American institutions by Hunter S. Thompson. Altered states allowed humans to physically perceive new realities and express them.
But despite engineering these massive cultural and technological revolutions, the political establishment viewed this cognitive expansion as a direct threat to institutional authority. And this reaction plunged the medical world into a 56-year dark age.
Yes, the 1970 Controlled Substances Act.
Exactly. It placed LSD in Schedule 1, legally defining it as having a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use.
Both of which were demonstrably false at the time they were written. I mean, the safety margin of LSD is astronomically high. The LD50, which is the lethal dose for 50% of a population, is estimated to be 12,000 micrograms. Yeah. With the standard dose being 100 micrograms, the safety margin is 120 times the effective dose. There are no confirmed deaths from an LSD overdose in the medical literature. Furthermore, the therapeutic efficacy was heavily documented before 1970, with over 1,000 clinical papers already published showing immense promise for treating alcoholism and mood disorders.
The criminalization was entirely political. And we don't have to guess about the motives because the documents highlight John Ehrlichman, Richard Nixon's domestic policy advisor, later admitting on the record that the criminalization of psychedelics and cannabis was a deliberate political lie.
It's a chilling admission.
It really is. It was designed to legally disrupt the anti-war left and black communities. The administration associated their political opponents with these substances, heavily criminalized them, and used the law as a tool for systemic disruption.
And this political weaponization also generated the public health myths that persist today. Specifically, the misconception of the bad trip.
Right.
A challenging psychological experience is rarely inherent to the molecule itself. It is largely a product of the unregulated variables created by prohibition, unknown dosing, adulterated chemistry, and terrible environments. The concepts of set and setting, your internal psychological baseline, and your physical environment are the primary dictators of the experience.
Which makes sense. Prohibition stripped away the clinical oversight and precise dosing that maximized psychological safety.
Exactly.
And the staggering cost of that suppression became painfully clear when we finally got the 2016 fMRI studies that mapped the human brain on LSD. Let's dig into the biological scans from your research.
Yeah, the scans showed exactly what we discussed earlier. Decreased default mode network activity and massive communication between brain regions that normally never interact. But more importantly, it showed a massive increase in neuroplasticity. The brain is flooded with brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
Wait, BDNF, I've seen that described in your notes as essentially miracle growth of the brain. Is that the mechanism here? It's physically forcing the brain to grow new neural pathways.
Precisely. It is promoting the rapid growth of new synapses. Old pathological thought patterns, like the rigid loops of depression or addiction, can be physically overwritten. This is why the psychedelic model of addiction treatment completely upends the traditional psychiatric model.
Because the traditional model relies on lifelong symptom management.
Right. Daily pharmaceutical substitution, which carries relapse rates hovering between 40 and 60%. But the psychedelic model targets the root cause. Clinical data shows a single guided LSD session has a 50 to 70% success rate for severe alcoholism.
That is incredible.
And a single ibogaine session can completely eliminate opioid withdrawal symptoms. The molecule is not suppressing the craving. The neuroplasticity is dissolving the psychological architecture that maintains the addiction.
See, if the fMRI data proves this physically forces the brain into a hyperflexible state of neuroplasticity, then classifying it as scheduled tie wasn't just a political misstep. It was essentially an active, decades-long blockade against the human brain's natural ability to heal its own trauma.
That's exactly what it was.
We allowed a massive addiction industrial complex to thrive, billing billions of dollars for lifelong management, while the exact tool capable of overriding those loops was locked in a vault.
And that undeniable mounting clinical evidence is precisely what forced the 2026 executive order we are examining today. The data simply became too overwhelming for the federal government to ignore. But unlocking that vault has triggered a brand new, highly complex conflict.
The economic war over patents.
Right. We are moving from a war on drugs to a race to corporatize consciousness.
Which brings us back to those 2026 DEA quotas. 12 million LSD doses, 50,000 grams of psilocybin. This is fueling massive pharmaceutical land grabs. Companies like Compass Pathways, ATA Life Sciences, and MindMed are rushing into this newly legitimized space.
Yes.
Now, they cannot patent the natural molecules themselves because prior art is already established, and in cases like psilocybin, they are naturally occurring compounds. So instead, they are patenting the specific crystalline structures of the synthesis known as polymorphs.
Right. And they're also patenting highly specific dosing protocols, the physical environment of the therapy room itself, and proprietary analogs like Sabin's CYB003 or MindMed's MM120.
Which creates a profound structural tension in the medical field. The pharmaceutical justification is straightforward. Navigating FDA clinical trials costs tens of millions of dollars. Without the financial incentive of patent protection and market exclusivity, corporations will not fund the research required to bring these therapies into the mainstream healthcare apparatus.
But the cognitive liberty counterargument points out that these molecules have existed for millennia, and the foundational clinical research proving their safety and efficacy was already completed in the 1960s before the government deliberately suppressed it.
Think about what this means for you right now if someone in your family struggles with severe treatment-resistant depression. If the very same government that suppressed this medicine for 50 years is now handing out exclusive market monopolies to corporations, allowing them to charge $10,000 or $15,000 for a guided session, are we just trading a criminal prohibition for a financial one?
It's a very real concern.
Can you truly patent a profound spiritual experience and then put it behind a paywall?
That is the defining ethical and economic question of this new era. Patenting the therapeutic use of these compounds risks creating a deeply stratified two-tier medical system.
Right.
The wealthy gain access to profound neuroplastic psychological healing, while the poor remain trapped in trauma, reliant on the traditional, less effective psychiatric models.
Is there an alternative framework?
Yes, the decriminalization model, pioneered heavily by Oregon's measure 109 years ago. That focuses on licensing the therapy and the facilitators without restricting access to a single corporate monopoly. It prioritizes broad access and competitive pricing over exclusive market capture.
We are watching a paradigm shift unfold in real time. The Kansas missile silo is empty, and the era of underground industrial production has largely ceased. But the chemical and therapeutic knowledge remains permanently integrated into our culture.
It does. The clinical data demands that we confront how much suffering could have been avoided over the last 56 years.
Yep.
It forces us to acknowledge that the brain's reducing valve, while absolutely vital for our immediate day-to-day survival, might be the exact mechanism holding back the next major leap in our cognitive evolution.
As we step into this new landscape of medical legitimacy in 2026, we have to look critically at the data in your stack and ask ourselves a larger question. If a single microscopic molecule could fundamentally rewire human technology, revolutionize art, and completely upend psychiatric medicine while being actively hunted by the state for half a century, what will the human mind achieve now that the vault is permanently open? What other parts of our cognitive potential have we been filtering out, just waiting to be rediscovered? Thank you for listening to the Golden Gems podcast. We'll be back next time with another deep dive. Until then, keep exploring, keep listening, and keep celebrating the power of uncompromising voices.